welcome everybody to this RECONNECT webinar entitled How to Overcome the EU's Legitimacy Crisis, Institutional Reforms and Citizen Preferences. My name is Oliver Treib. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Münster, and I'm also one of the principal investigators of the University of Münster's RECONNECT project team. As you may know, RECONNECT is a large multidisciplinary research project funded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 framework program. And the mission of the project is reconciling Europe with its citizens through democracy and the rule of law. And RECONNECT has started a series on the conference, a series of webinars on the conference on the future of Europe. And this event today is the second webinar in this series. And I'm very happy to be the moderator of this webinar today. In the next couple of minutes, I'd like to do very briefly three things. First of all, I'll give you a short introduction to the topic. Secondly, introduce the speakers that we have gathered, and thirdly, say a bit about how we are going to proceed in the next 90 minutes or so. Very briefly about the topic. Now, I guess you might have learned that yesterday saw the opening ceremony of the conference on the future of Europe. So we will see in the next 12 months or so a broad debate about the EU and how it might be reformed in one way or another. In my view, this debate is really urgently needed, since the EU faces a serious legitimacy crisis. Over the past couple of decades, we have seen many European citizens increasingly following Eurosceptic political parties and politicians who basically challenge the authority and the legitimacy of the European Union. So there were negative referendums on the constitutional treaty in a couple of countries. And recently, we even lost one of the member states due to a negative membership referendum in the UK. So Euroscepticism is a force to be reckoned with, and so the EU should also try to come up with ideas on how to overcome or at least mitigate this losing support and the ensuing legitimacy crisis. In this webinar, we want to zoom in on the key players in this reform process, and that is citizens. So we do have a lot of research on citizens' general attitudes towards the EU, towards European integration, towards policy preferences, etc. But we know relatively little, or surprisingly little, about their more specific EU-related reform preferences. So what kind of EU do citizens really want? And it was the goal of the University of Münster's RECONNECT project team to actually fill this gap. And to this end, we have collected extensive survey data on citizens' ideal setting of the EU. The webinar will start with a short presentation of some key results from this empirical exercise by my colleague Bernd Schlipphack. A very warm welcome to you, Bernd. Bernd is a professor of research methods at the University of Münster, and he is my co-principal investigator on the RECONNECT project. After this presentation, we will move on to a discussion with a panel of experts that we have gathered here. And I'm very happy to welcome Professors Richard Laffan, Vivian Schmidt, and Michael Zürn. I'm really happy that we managed to bring you all together here. Actually, I think none of them really needs an introduction, but I'm going to remind you of a few things that might be important. Richard Laffan is affiliated to the European University Institute in Florence, where she serves as the director and also as a professor at the Robert Schuman Center. And she's also the director of the Global Governance Program of the EUI. She has worked extensively on various aspects of EU politics, recently, for example, on the EU's POLI crisis and also on the challenges posed by the rise of Eurosceptic parties. So a warm welcome to you, Bridget. Next, Vivian Schmidt, also a warm welcome to you. Vivian is a Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration in the Pardee School at Boston University. And at the moment she is in Italy because she's also an honorary professor at Luis Guido Carli University in Rome. Vivian also has worked a lot about EU democracy or democracy in Europe, for example, on the concept of throughput legitimacy and also on the role of elite discourse for democracy in Europe. And also her latest monograph has a really apt title for our discussion today. Just appeared with Oxford University Press, and the title is Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy. So she should have one or two words to say about our topic today. Finally, I welcome also Michael Zürn. Michael is director at the WZB in Berlin, the Berlin Social Science Center, and he's a professor of international relations at Free University of Berlin, where he's also one of the speakers of the cluster of excellence on contestations of the liberal script. And Michael has worked a lot about topics that we discussed today from an international relations and international organization perspective, mostly also incorporating the EU. So processes of politicization, of legitimacy of international authority, and also about the way in which globalization has transformed domestic cleavage structures. So this is the lineup that we have gathered. Let me finally say a few words about the timeline so that everybody has a rough idea of how we're going to proceed. As I said, we will begin with Bernd's presentation of our project results, which will take about 15 minutes. Then the roundtable discussion, it should take about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there should be about 20-25 minutes in the end for a Q&A session where we also want to discuss questions from the audience. So those of you who have logged on to the webinar, please feel free to type in your questions into the chat box. We will monitor that, and we hope that we can select a couple of questions and discuss them with our experts. In this context, just very briefly, I also want to mention Dana Azpodin. You cannot see her. She is the invisible hand behind the scenes of this webinar, but she is monitoring the chat box, and she kind of gives me some questions for the Q&A session. Okay, so much for my introduction, and I think with that I'm going to hand over to Bernd Schlippack, who will give us a flavor of the data that we have gathered. Bernd, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Oliver, and a very warm welcome also from my side. Before presenting our main findings, hopefully they can now be seen by everybody, I just want to highlight two things. First, I would like to emphasize the role of Konstantin Schäfer, our postdoc, in conducting our work package. Without Konstantin, we would not have been able to collect, analyze, and interpret data in the way I presented today. Thanks. Second, if you feel that the presentation rushes through the findings, I want to refer you to our deliverable and the respective blog post on the RECONNECT website. Of course, we are also happy to answer any question you may have. But now to the presentation. The ideal setting of the EU in the mind of European citizens. First of all, why should we care? Well, the EU is confronted with a serious challenge to its political legitimacy. So more and more citizens have come to support Eurosceptic politicians who put the EU's authority into questions, and most recently with the Brexit, we have even seen one country leaving the EU as a consequence of a referendum. Hence, and this seems like a consensus also in the scientific literature, the EU is in need of reforms to increase its democratic legitimacy among citizens. The EU and its various actors, such as the European Commission and the European Parliament, have already reacted to this. One example is the white paper on the future of Europe. Another and more recent and seemingly more important example is the conference on the future of Europe that started yesterday. Despite the prominence of the issue, we still don't know much about what citizens would actually prefer as an ideal EU. And to shed more light on this, we explored three main questions relating to different dimensions of the European Union. That is vertical and horizontal integration as well as the institutional setting. Regarding vertical integration, we were interested in how Europeans think about a further transfer of political authority to the European Union. Regarding horizontal integration, we focused on whether citizens support a redistribution of wealth from richer to poorer member states. That is the question of solidarity. And finally, our most innovative point, we explored which characteristics of the institutional decision-making process would make the EU ideal in the mind of citizens. The fourth questions runs counter to questions 1 to 3. We are interested in whether the ideal EU actually differs over countries and or over characteristics of citizens that may be associated with being winner or loser of societal transformations such as globalizations. To do so, to shed a first light, we fielded an online survey implemented by Kantar. And it took place in 6 countries: Germany, Denmark, Spain, France, Hungary, and Poland. In each of our 6 countries, we asked 2,000 respondents for their views on the topic. The survey was fielded between September and October of the last year, 2020, and we used quota for age, gender, and education. That was done to secure that the distribution of these variables in the sample resembles the distribution of these variables also in the overall population. To jump to the findings, we first asked citizens for their attitudes toward the transfer of authority to the European Union. Higher values in this graph indicate that citizens prefer a more competent European Union. That is, they prefer more competences to be transferred to the European Union. Lower values in this region represent that citizens prefer a retransfer of competences from the European level to the member state level, or to the domestic level. As you can see, there is a tendency for favoring the status quo, represented by those citizens choosing the values 3 and 4, altogether about 50% of all respondents. Furthermore, when looking at the end of the spectrum, we observe that more citizens prefer a retransfer from the EU level to the member states compared to those that would prefer an additional transfer of competences to the European level. When looking at differences over countries for this question, we see that there are some. Danish respondents are by far more favorable of retransferring competences from the European level to the domestic level. In contrast, respondents in Hungary and Spain are slightly in favor of transferring more competences to the European Union level. And when it comes to citizens' characteristics, we find that younger, more highly educated, and citizens with higher socioeconomic status are more in favor for transferring more competences to the European level. Question 2, the horizontal integration. We ask citizens to locate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10. 10 means full agreement with the statement, wealth should be redistributed from the richer to the poorer countries in the EU. 1 means full agreement with the statement, wealth should not be redistributed among member states. Once again, citizens tend to locate themselves at the center of the scale, demonstrating a preference for the status quo. When looking again at the end of the spectrums, we can see that the number of citizens specifically in favor of redistribution, this end of the spectrum, outnumber those being very skeptical regarding redistribution. Again, we find variance over countries. Respondents in richer countries, especially in Germany and Denmark, are more skeptical toward redistribution, and respondents in poorer countries are more favorable toward it. When it comes to citizens' characteristics, we find that citizens with higher education and citizens with higher socioeconomic status are more skeptical toward redistribution. This runs somewhat counter to the impression that highly educated and richer citizens are more in favor of integration on all dimensions. Question 3. We come to our third and most innovative dimension of our findings. What are the characteristics of a decision-making process that makes citizens most favorable toward the EU? To explore this question, we use the state-of-the-art method that is called conjoint analysis or multifactorial survey. We asked each respondent to compare 4 pairs of different hypothetical decision-making processes in the EU. Each decision-making process varied along 6 attributes, of which 2 attributes relate to the authority dimension, 2 attributes relate to the procedure dimension, and 2 attributes relate to the performance dimension. This is pretty abstract, so just let's have a look at them. Here you see the value or levels of each attribute. For example, regarding the first attribute, bindingness, we varied the decision-making process to either state that 1, a country must apply the decision, 2, single countries may deviate in exceptional circumstances from implementing the policy, that is, they have an opt-out possibility, or 3, each country may apply the decision voluntarily. Furthermore, when it comes to the possibility of being outvoted, we differentiated between veto power and 2 and 3, the hurdles of being outvoted. For channels of participation, we varied between through parliamentary elections only, through parliamentary elections and a citizen consultation, and through parliamentary elections and a referendum. For public information, we differentiated between public information not being available after the decision was made, and being available throughout the whole process of decision-making. Regarding the benefit for one's own country, we differentiated between less, the same, and more than for other countries, and for problem solving, we varied between a small, a moderate, and a large degree. Again, this is still rather complex to demonstrate to respondents, so how did we do it? Unfortunately, we have no English screenshot of what respondents were to see in our survey. We did not field the survey in UK or Ireland, so we have to stick here with the German one. I hope that you can still get an impression of what respondents saw and had to do. So they received the 2 options, option A and option B. And they were then asked to compare both options and to say which of these options they would favor. Then they were also asked for their individual rating of each option. So they could say they were absolutely against the option or absolutely in favor of it. Each of these options mirror a hypothetical combination of the different levels of the 6 subdimensions. All in all, each respondent received 4 of such pairs of options A and B. That is, for each respondent, we have 8 options that were rated separately and 4 options that the respondent found more favorable compared to the other option in the received pair. Coming to the findings, this is the, if you want, statistical graph showing the findings. It's really complex and it's lots too complex to actually explain it here. So just let me jump to the main conclusions by saying that this graph is also explained in the deliverable and the blog post in more detail. But what you need to know is this. The ideal European Union in the mind of the average citizens offers the possibility for opt-outs in exceptional circumstances. It allows member states to be outvoted by a majority of 75%, and it allows citizens to participate via elections and consultations. The ideal European Union provides full information throughout the policy-making process. It creates policies that provide the same benefits to all member states, and it solves the underlying problem as effectively as possible. Coming to our question 4, these findings are quite robust for different countries and citizens' characteristics. So we find not much difference or variation when we look at different countries or on different groups of citizens. Summing these findings up, there are 2 main points actually. First, the ideal EU in the mind of citizens is close to the status quo with regard to the distribution of competences between the European Union and member states and the distribution of resources. However, and somewhat in contrast, the ideal EU in the mind of citizens requires more participation in the form of consultations. It requires more transparency throughout the policy-making process, and it requires more equality regarding the distribution of policy outcomes. How can this be done? I don't know, and the survey cannot answer this, but hopefully our roundtable participants have an answer to that. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernd, for this overview of our findings. Indeed, let's discuss the reform outlook that this might open up. I think what is interesting from these findings is that basically it's kind of a variety of trajectories that seem to be relatively consensual among citizens, and others where basically the status quo is the most preferred option, and whenever you move into one or the other direction, you will get punished perhaps by one group or the other that has opposing preferences. Now, I think we should do this little roundtable discussion in 2 rounds, both taking about half of our 30 to 40 minutes. So short inputs by our 3 experts. The first round, I think, would perhaps deal more with really your views on how to reform the EU in order to win back the hearts and minds of citizens. And the second round, then perhaps more about the conference on the future of Europe and how your assessment is whether the conference will be able to deliver such reforms. So let's turn to the first round. And I think I'm just going to pose a very simple question here. That is, in your views, what are the main things that should be reformed to increase the legitimacy of the European Union, to increase support by citizens of the European Union? And I think it would be, we need some order, and I think I'm picking the alphabetical order, which means I would perhaps start with Bridget, then moving on to Vivian, because I take the second names in the alphabetical order, and then finally having Michael. So maybe 5 minutes for your reactions for this first round, and then we would move on to the second one. Bridget.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for asking me to be part of this great panel. So let me begin by challenging what I think is the framing of this session, and that is that the EU is suffering from a profound legitimacy crisis. I don't think your data supports that. I don't think the evidence you have gleaned from those citizens supports that. And when I was preparing for this, I also looked at our Schuman Center EUI YouGov Solidarity survey and also the Conference on the Future of Europe survey. And I think none of those suggest or support the contention that this is a profound legitimacy crisis. And so if you look at 66% of the last Eurobarometer, 66% of respondents argued that membership of the EU was a good thing, 47 had a positive image of the EU, and 7 out of 10 favored the EU. And I think you also see in your results this status quo bias in answer to some of your questions. Now, if there was a profound legitimacy crisis, I would expect to see different results in your survey. So I think where the debate is not so much a profound legitimacy crisis, rather it is what should the EU do and what should the EU be? And there are very different attitudes across the citizenship of Europe about this question. And so I would rather see this as a question of contestation and politics in what is a maturing polity. So I would think that the EU is a maturing polity. There's more politicization, more contestation, but that is what one would expect at this juncture in the development of the EU. So moving on then very rapidly from that, and I'm happy to talk about that, but where is the project for the future from your data and from other data we have available? And I think it's pretty clear that citizens have a range of issues that they feel that the EU should address. And in your survey, it comes out as climate and the environment. That's always number 1 or 2 now in whatever survey when you ask Europeans what the EU should do. So climate and environment, fighting terrorism, migration, refugees. So citizens seem to recognize transnational issues in the EU. So I would have thought that there certainly is a project there that is in tune with very much in tune with what the strategic goals of the EU at the moment, which are the Green Deal, digital transformation, a new economic social compact, and then Europe's role in the world. And I think the evidence, it's pretty clear across most survey data in Europe today that those are the issues that Europeans want the EU to engage with. Also, it's interesting that in the solidarity, the NewGov survey that the EUI does every year, the Europeans are no longer content with market Europe. That's not enough. They also, in the last survey, the 2021, majorities in 10 member states wanted a protective Europe, and then in a number of others, protection plus global Europe. So in other words, all that melds with, there is a political project around which Europeans can coalesce. Of course, when it comes down to the what to do and how to do it, then one would expect politics to intervene. I'd also just very briefly say something about solidarity. because your data basically identifies the net contributor net beneficiary cleavage. But in fact, the solidarity survey that Anton Hemmerich and Philip Genschel did, they ask more questions beyond that. And what comes out very clearly is that solidarity is national first. There isn't a single majority in any member state where a majority of citizens will say that their taxpayers' money should be used for foreigners, the other member states. So in other words, when you look at the creditor-debtor, the utilitarian comes shining through. But it's also interesting to note that the 5 countries in this survey where there was support for use of domestic tax income for citizens of other countries were, interestingly, Denmark, Germany, Spain, Greece, and Lithuania. In other words, it's not a traditional net contributor, net beneficiary cleavage. So on solidarity, there's a more nuanced picture. It is solidarity, firstly at home, but there is an openness to solidarity beyond, but for particular types of crises, not for all, and for particular sorts of help. And what comes out very clearly is that the arguments around reciprocal solidarity tend to be the strongest. So saying that one should do this because it is morally the right thing to do gets far less support than saying we might need help in the future. So don't work on identity, don't work on the moral suasion, but rather that in a highly interdependent EU with the ties that bind going very deeply, then insurance mechanisms, we all might need help in the future, seem to resonate much better with citizens than simply this is normatively a good thing. So just to sum up, I don't think it's a crisis. I think it's politics and politicization and contestation. And I think that, for me, is a maturing polity rather than that this should be defined as a profound legitimacy crisis. That doesn't mean that there aren't legitimacy issues to do with the EU, as there are with all political systems. But I'd like us to at least discuss the framing of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I think we should first move on to the other 2, and perhaps there can be then one more round where perhaps me and Bernd just say 1 or 2 things about the questions that arise for us in our survey data. Vivian.
Yes, so thanks. And thinking that Bridget might say something like that, or Michael, I decided to sort of focus my comments more on the question of what to do about economic governance, essentially, in terms of focusing in on reforms. I found the study fascinating, and some of the findings fit with my own views of the need to deepen European integration in certain areas while decentralizing and democratizing decision-making. I think that all sorts of institutional reforms are necessary, of course, in response to the EU's many crises: Eurozone, migration, health in terms of the pandemic, climate, and more. But here I want to focus in on the economics related to the Eurozone and try to suggest how to increase integration while respecting citizens' desires for more autonomy, but also solidarity. In terms of a certain amount, how much redistribution would work for all. So my main question is, how can the EU's economic governance be reformed so as to ensure that the EU moves beyond the COVID-19 pandemic most effectively toward a more sustainable, equitable growth and prosperity for all Europeans or all European countries, but also providing increased democratic legitimacy? So I agree with Bridget that I don't see the EU in a crisis of legitimacy anymore the way I did with the Eurozone crisis. Nevertheless, there are certain things to be fixed. So important to note that the pandemic response represents a new beginning. If we think about the decade preceding the pandemic in the Eurozone, instead of providing some form of debt forgiveness with mutual risk-sharing instruments, the EU reinforced the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, mandating austerity and structural reform policies overseen through the European semester. Thus, we got a Eurozone engaged in governing by rules and ruling by numbers, with the wrong rules and numbers which didn't work, leading to what I called, as thank you for mentioning my book, what I've called Europe's crisis of legitimacy, in which doubling down on the procedural rules led to poor economic performance and increasingly toxic politics. And though by 2015, even beginning in 2013, even though the economics improved as the rules were applied more and more flexibly, the damage had been done. But importantly, ever since the pandemic, things have changed. There's been a recognition for the need for new ideas about how to deal with the European economy under challenge, not just from health and economic disaster, but also from climate change. So most notable among the initiatives have been the Commission's Next Generation EU, by investing in the green transition, the digital transformation, and also addressing social inequities. And I think there's a lot in your study to suggest that this is exactly what the citizens might want. And certainly Bridget pointed to other such issues. And basically, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, the RRF, is tremendously important in terms of investment funds for countries in need. It constitutes a massive achievement, a major taboo-breaking moment, really, in particular with the past, but new ideas still remain to be called for. So the question is, what are they? So it seems to me that one needs to rethink Eurozone economic, the European economic governance framework beyond the old ideas for an enhanced role for the state as an entrepreneur to promote growth and provide investments to meet the challenges of the green transition and the digital transformation, while repairing the damages wrought by both the Euro crisis management, unmanaged globalization, as well as the pandemic, in order to push toward greater social equity with more democracy. So very briefly in the time that remains, I'm going to suggest a couple of ideas in terms of different EU institutional actors. So let's think monetary policy, macroeconomic coordination, and the ECB. There are actually many new ideas about what the ECB could do to move, on the output legitimacy side in terms of policy effectiveness and performance, to move from a focus on the primary objectives of stability to secondary objectives focused on full employment as a target, no neutral bond buying, green bonds, and the rest. But the question for the ECB is, how do you democratize and ensure accountability while doing this? In other words, how do we bring citizens in, which is clearly one of the main issues in your study. And I guess one way would be to increase ECB accountability to the European Parliament, maybe with ECB EP dialogues. Another way that I think would actually respond more to these demands would be to create new venues for democratic debate and deliberation on EU macroeconomic governance. So what about a great macroeconomic dialogue, a kind of yearly conference to give the ECB direction for its secondary objectives and bring the citizens into that in a variety of ways? We can talk about that later if anyone's interested. But what about industrial policy in the European semester? Here, again, on the performance, there's a temporary pandemic fund. There needs to be permanent EU level debt with a serious EU budget, more EU owned resources for investment bonds to fund the green transition and digital transformation, as well as to address inequalities. Think about this as sovereign wealth funds, but to provide to invest as grants to all member states, and for EU level cross-border endeavors, for redistributive purposes and innovative funds focused on unemployment, refugee migrant integration, poverty alleviation, etc. But finally, again, how do we democratize this? How do we, in fact, one needs to decentralize as well as democratize this. The European semester, of course, is this amazing architecture of coordination but it's been seen as highly hierarchical top-down. This has actually changed with the pandemic to some extent. But how do we ensure that this works better? And to my mind, again, one needs to rethink semester procedures. What about an industrial policy dialogue, or make it part of the macroeconomic dialogue with different targets for member states? So, but for this, you need to decentralize and democratize the European semester, make it more bottom-up than top-down, let member states decide fully how to promote their growth, which is actually what they're doing via these national resilience and recovery funds, but change the nature of evaluations, turn the fiscal boards and competitiveness councils into industrial policy councils, but democratize by bringing in social partners and civil society actors. And I think I've run out of time, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian. Moving on to Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, by the way, for this wonderful presentation and this study. I mean, this is great data. This is a very good analysis, and I have learned quite something from it. So, congratulations. I think I'll take up to some extent the issue that Bridget raised with the question: is it really true that we have a legitimacy crisis, and can we derive this sort of statement from the survey data that you just created? And in that sense, I want to take up this challenge of the methodological issue. What do we need to see? Or how can we talk about necessary reforms in order to improve the legitimacy? And here I just would suggest that it's probably not possible to draw any direct inferences from a survey to possibilities for increasing the legitimacy of any kind of institution in the EU. Why? And I think I'm not speaking against your analysis, not at all, but I think essentially we are let me give you a counterfactual, to put it this way. The counterfactual being, and I think the counterfactual is not very far away from your findings. The counterfactual tells us that survey data shows that a majority and the average is in favor of the status quo, of the institutional status quo, essentially something that you found out. And the second thing is, nevertheless, we realize that this specific institutional setup undermines support for the EU over time. Very slowly, with ups and downs, but there is a certain danger and a certain trend that things get worse in terms of acceptance and legitimacy. In that sense, I think the method in order to talk about what needs to be done in order to put it now in neutral terms, in order to avoid the term legitimacy crisis, in order to increase the acceptance, is probably that we need a sort of a two-step process. I mean, the first one would be really to know what kind of institutional features, and we talk now about institutional features, right, increases acceptance and legitimacy of the EU. And then the second step is this kind of reform that we would identify theoretically as necessary, does that receive sufficient support on the side of the population? So there is still the need to know quite a lot about the people, but it would be much more indirect, that you cannot infer from the identification that, or from the statement that people support the status quo, that the status quo is essentially guaranteeing the legitimacy of the EU over the long run. So, I mean, that is just the sort of starting statement here. That probably brings me a little bit in between the position of Bridget and Vivian. If we take now Vivian's position to be there is a legitimacy crisis, and Bridget's position to say no, there is no legitimacy crisis, I would say yes, it is true, people like the status quo if you take the average, but that does not make it sure or assure us that in the long run there is not a decline in acceptance of the EU because of the working of the institutions. And having said this, the question, of course, is what can be done? What do we need to do? And I think, of course, you asked this question about what kind of optimal institutional design would work in your conjoint analysis. And if we take the conjoint analysis, I think, again, Bridget is probably right in saying there is an element of normalization, of politicization, of contestation. But then I guess what we need in the EU is creating institutions that can channel this contestation. That essentially brings contestation into the institution. And what does that mean? It essentially means, at least to some extent, centralization. Because if you want to institutionalize opposition, and that's the major problem of the EU, that we don't have opposition, and if you're against a certain policy, essentially you can be loyal or you can exit, but you don't have any voice within the as a population. I'm not talking about the governments. I'm talking about the population. You cannot give a voice and vote for a different party because you don't know what you vote for when you vote for the European Parliament, in spite of the fact that the European Parliament is quite powerful. So what it needs probably is to connect the European Parliament with the Commission much closer. But it does not suffice to identify a commissioner president. Probably the commissioner president needs to be elected by the parliament, but in addition to that, you need to have transnational lists. So it would be a complete package of creating a sort of a government that is accountable, and that allows the introduction of opposition within the institutional system. And that is probably needed. But then, is there support for this? Given your survey data, very little, I guess. So probably one has to think, and that comes very close to what Vivian said, about ways, I mean, how can we identify certain areas where there is high acceptance of the EU, where we can create accountability and centralization, but then on the other hand, where are the areas where we can decentralize and give some competences back to the nation states? So in order to have a less of a complicated system where essentially both types, the EU governance and the national governments, has problems of creating accountability, because on the national people, you often politicians argue, well, I mean, it's not our fault, it's the fault of the EU. And in that sense, there's a certain danger that institutions on both sides, on the national level and on the European level, get undermined. So it would be probably some way of drawing things apart, identifying the areas in which the EU needs to be strong and where we can essentially make an accountable government that gives room for an opposition. But then again, also making clear there are some areas where we can live with national decisions. Then, of course, I mean, very brief final remark on that. Then, of course, there's the question: what should go to the EU, and what should go back to the national level? And there, I'm actually a little bit unsure how to read the data. I'm in that respect, I'm a little bit less optimistic than Bridget that this is pretty rational what they say. My sense, to some extent, is people would like to do the EU, the foreign policy, the traditional foreign policy, the handling of European interests in the global context against the Chinese, Russian, and American threat. And everything what could be labeled domestic policy is very much where they do not like to see a very strong EU. I mean, that's just, I mean, it's now very blunt, I agree, but that's essentially another reading of the list of the issues that you have in your report, where you have climate threats, foreign policy, stuff like that, very much on the top of the list, and things like regulation, solidarity, even monetary policy, all things that would be essentially domestic policies, much lower on the list. So, I mean, I'm wondering a little bit about this side of your findings, and would like to hear your comment here as well, how you read those lists at the end of your paper. So this would be essentially my comments. I think before we can speak, how can we increase the acceptance of the EU via institutional reform? There are many other things, but we talk now specifically via institutional reform. We need to know essentially the causal effects of different institutional setups to the people. And there we probably have to work with something like experiments. Survey do not suffice here. And then the second question is the thinking of the people so that it would allow such a reform? And there, obviously, there are currently some limitations.
Thank you very much, Michael. Allow me maybe 2 sentences about the kind of the data that have been mentioned quite extensively. So I think on the one hand, we didn't present, because we had some time restrictions, didn't present the policy preferences or kind of the policy priorities that people think should be pursued by the EU. And indeed, it is true that there are quite some differences. And if you look at this list, it's, in our view, it's relatively clear that policy areas where the collective contribution of the EU for the solution or kind of the tackling of these issue areas is clearest. So climate change being one, but I think also migration was one. So kind of the areas where it's clear, okay, we cannot do that individually in the member states, we're too small, etc. And we have this notion, or we have this hunch, that there might also be something about kind of the collective protection from threats from the outside in the background, but this is just it's speculation more than anything else. So you also have these areas where you could at least construe a story. You could say, well, you know, we have to stand together. We as Europeans stand together against the vagaries of global economy or whatever global migration flows, etc. So in that sense, this is one side, and I kind of disagree with Bridget's reading, because some of the redistributive areas, especially social policy and labor and things like that, they really rank very low on the list. So it really seems that people don't like this to be tackled by the EU. So it's more like, well, how can we, what are the areas where we are still strong enough to kind of do that, and where we also maybe need more solidarity than we have as collective Europeans, and others where we clearly see that we need the EU. And about the crisis, of course, I mean, you can always argue, is the glass half full or half empty? I just, from the data that we have, I think you can at least see that there are different camps. So, of course, there is kind of an average position, which is oftentimes the status quo in terms of the EU authority. But there is a divergence, a polarization, and we have very strong kind of non-support for further integration. So as long as you can find solutions that do not really diminish the autonomy of member states, I think you're fine. But as soon as this can be construed as kind of taking more power away from the nation state, I think there will be quite a strong minority, at least, that will object. And there are these Eurosceptic actors, and they're kind of muted due to the COVID crisis, but I'm pretty sure they will maybe resurface. So it's kind of but it's also more loose interpretation of the data than really hard evidence.
Can I ask the two of you one question about the two top issues, climate and migration? Do you have any additional evidence that climate does not stand only for negotiating a good global climate deal with the US and China, and that it really involves European regulation of climate policy within Europe. And the same with migration. Do you really have any additional evidence that it is not only securing the borders of the EU against migrants, but that it is also regulating migration within the EU and possibly also quotas? So, I mean, I'm just wondering how to interpret this finding. I mean, I don't have any evidence to say my interpretation is the right one, to be sure. I'm just asking you whether you have any additional information that supports your interpretation.
Yeah. I think the short answer is no, we don't. So it's really just speculation. And it could, you're right. I mean, it could also be that people thought about the role of the EU in the world and kind of as a kind of a voice for improving climate change on a global level. Very well possible. Not sure whether this is the most plausible way of thinking that you can assume from respondents, but we just don't know. So it's both equally plausible. All we know is people want the EU to focus on environment, climate change, and migration more than social policy and some other things. Okay, so I think we should also, or Bernd, do you want to add something?
One minor response, actually. Please keep in mind, because of the centralization versus decentralization proposal, actually, keep in mind that we asked citizens or respondents, in what issue area would you like the most the EU to act, actually? And even in those issue areas, that is the one and only issue area in which citizens said they would like the EU to act, actually. Even in those issue areas were citizens not ready to provide the EU more authority leeway, if you want. Even in these issue areas, citizens were not ready to transfer more competences to the European level. So this is just, you know, that the conjoint design and the question on the issue areas belong together. So even in the most likely case, citizens were not willing to have a more powerful EU. So even in those issues that might be, you know, more sensible to citizens, they wouldn't allow centralization of powers.
Yeah, that's, I think, an important clarification. Okay, so time is rushing. It's 5 o'clock by now, almost. So I think we should do a quick second round so that we also have time for some questions and answers from the audience. So let's talk about the conference on the future of Europe. We basically don't know what it's going to be like. It's just opened. We have a rough idea of there being citizen engagement platforms, etc. It's going to be virtual, it's going to be meeting based and so on. But really the question is to the three of you, how do you assess the ability of the conference on the future of Europe to really produce something meaningful that could be at least beneficial to the EU as a whole, and then also what might be the obstacles? And we have seen a lot of infighting from a couple of member state governments who seem to be quite worried that too much power is taken away from them, and so they want to already kind of put in a little bit of a break in this whole process. So we can already see that there is kind of this sovereignty issue is already on the table before anything has already started. So what can the conference on the future of Europe deliver in your view? Is it just perhaps a talking shop, or is there something really meaningful coming out of this? Bridget, I think we'll start again with you.
Okay, well, firstly, I think I should say that the future of Europe will be as determined by how great power competition develops in our global world as it will be by the conference on the future of Europe. So I think we need to take it in that context. Let me just say two things about it. One, process matters. In other words, will this event or series of events, will it be capable of mobilizing beyond the usual suspects? Will it be capable of using digital platforms in ways that are innovative? So, mobilization. Secondly, I would say deliberation, because, and this goes to the point that if Michael is right, that the citizens are more likely to be interested in what is global, international, transnational, but not in, let's say, the domestic. But we need to tease that out, because if we think that the climate crisis is one of the great challenges facing the world and the EU, then to engage with citizens on what that actually means in terms of the transformation at every level, city, region, state, global, Europe, etc., etc. So I would have thought if it can generate a capacity for deliberation that gets us past the headlines on its migration or its climate, then I think it will serve a purpose. I'm not sure that citizens are that interested in the institutional niceties, but I'm very sure that those sitting around the table in the executive board, as it's called, will be very interested in the institutional dimensions. Why? Because it's about power, and it's about their respective power. And I imagine Guy Verhofstadt, I could write his speeches already. But again, the representatives of the member state governments will have a very different perspective. So I think we need to think of the Conference on the Future of Europe as happening at many different levels. But if it can mobilize and if it can generate a capacity for deliberation, then it will probably contribute to the kind of conversation that we have to have about our highly interdependent part of the world in a world of major systemic change. And whether one outcome would be treaty change, well, I have no idea. I simply don't know. And does having treaty change, is that the barometer for this exercise? I think if there's a good conversation about priorities, choices, and how to govern these big issues, then that will in and of itself be pedagogical across Europe. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. Vivian.
Yeah, so I fully endorse what Bridget said. I think she's absolutely right. It's mobilization, deliberation, but also there is an institutional dimension, as Bridget said. And it seems to me, from what I see, I don't think we can hope much about the deliberation dimension or citizen input, but we could hope for EU member states, because and the EU institutions actually to try to do something to unblock decision-making capability. And this would mean institutional reforms of one or another kind. I mean, I think particularly about differentiated integration to actually try to make that work better. I mean, we know that the EU is not going forward can go forward in lockstep. I think your study demonstrates that the citizens are very divided in how they think about moving forward, and as a result, my sense also is that member state leaders and EU institutional actors know this. So what would differentiated integration look like? I've been talking about this many times. It's not a hardcore Europe, but rather a soft core of overlapping clusters of European member states participating in the EU's many different policy communities. This fits with your suggestion that people might want opt-outs. But also, I think it's important to note that it still has to be administered by a single set of EU institutions with voice for all member states and all communities. But actually, perhaps one could argue that where you see a drilling down, where you see, say, an increased budget for the Eurozone, that those who actively participate would vote. So it seems to me that there can be discussions about how one moves forward with a more flexible EU. To give you only one example for the Eurozone, which is a case where I think it went way too far in terms of deepening European integration, in contrast, say, to migration policy or climate change, until the pandemic and the Resilience and Recovery Fund have put a lot of money into that. But basically, for example, in the Eurozone, to allow for differentiated integration, if member states were to say, want to block a permanent fund, those willing to move forward through enhanced cooperation for an EU budget should be the only ones to vote on that budget. Although everyone should be enabled to discuss it. So no separate Eurozone parliament, but separate voting for MEPs in a deeper budgetary union. This said, one can talk a lot about differentiation, but no differentiation should be possible in the EU's core commitments to the rule of law. This is another place where my sense is that this Convention on the Future of Europe really should focus how to ensure that everyone conforms to the rule of law. Another piece, and this is the institutional piece, is that the European Parliament needs to be brought in more and more areas in terms of the co-decision method. So Michael Zorn talked about a single set of transnational party lists, et cetera, to give the European Parliament, to make it more truly representative. But beyond that, it has to have a lot more to do in those key policy areas. It has almost no say. So it seems to me we need, for the Eurozone, it demands much more involvement of the European Parliament via the co-decision methods, and national parliaments in the European semester. This is also about the decentralization and democratization. But beyond that, many of the Eurozone treaties should be turned into ordinary legislation, whether using the passerelle clause or whatever. Abandon the unanimity rule for a 2/3 or 4/5 majority with opt-outs where necessary. It seems to me that everyone's been talking about this for a decade or more, and maybe this is another area on the institutional side. Citizens won't necessarily pay attention to this, but I think this is a moment when Eurozone leaders, not Eurozone, EU leaders need to figure out how to move forward. They all know that the unanimity rule is simply impossible, whether for rule of law issues or everything else. But beyond that, and this is the question, the big question: how do you bring citizens in more? It can't simply be through the representative route. So, as Bridget mentioned, deliberation, but also mobilization. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Michael.
I will be also shorter on this one as Bridget and Vivian. I mean, essentially, you ask us for a prediction, right? And Philip Tetlock's observation that social scientists regarding predictions not better than about throwing monkeys is probably still true. So I also would point to in addition to the deliberation, to the process moment, to two aspects which will be probably important for the outcome of this conference. One is, of course, that we will have very important elections before 2022, and Germany as well as France. I mean, let's say a combination of Le Pen and Laschet will probably bring less results than a combination of, let's say, Macron and Baerbock or something like this. So I mean, obviously it depends to some extent on those elections. I mean, it's probably nobody will contradict, but it's important to keep this in mind that we have those two elections before the end of this conference. The second thing that I would observe, I mean, we are in the process of probably, hopefully, leaving now a crisis. And what happens after a crisis is to some extent always a sort of a historical watershed, a critical juncture. And usually there are two possibilities, I think. One is now we are out of the crisis and now we can really prepare ourselves to make things better and to prevent the next crisis. A sort of a moment of mobilization, to use Vivian's terms, of a willingness to change things. But the outcome of a crisis can be also fatigue. Now we made it, now we are through, we managed it somehow. Let's calm down now for a moment. And I don't know, I mean, that's not very social scientific what I'm trying to say now, but my sense of the climate and of the atmosphere is that it rather points towards fatigue than towards mobilization in this moment of time. But maybe I'm looking too much to my own country because we traveled so little the last 12 months. But that would be probably something that would work against a great and significant outcome. But then, of course, we have to say, if not there, where then? I mean, it is probably the only place where we can hope to get some momentum for change in terms of better institutions. So in that sense, very little that I have to say on this conference. I just would like maybe to add, to have a deliberation dialogical element in our conversation. One little word to Vivian's differentiation. I'm always struggling a little bit with the sort of tension I think that we have. On the one hand, if we want to get people involved in the EU, having a strong parliament, having essentially public debates about the EU, having contestations as part of the political process, we need something like the institutionalization of opposition. And opposition is binary to government, right? The moment when we have too much of differentiation, of course, the danger is that we don't have any government at all, that we have only functionally delimited, circumscribed authorities that are not able to produce opposition in public debates, because it's so complicated to get an overview of all of those differentiated authorities. I mean, I see the attractiveness of it. I'm fully on this side. On the other hand, you see, of course, the need for politicization and opposition. I'm just trying to point out that there is a tension between those two things. Either going in the direction of a more institutionalized EU power that then allows for opposition and public debates about it is one direction. A differentiation of competences probably is another direction, and those two things contradict each other to some extent, at least in my view.
Thank you very much, Vivian. I'll give you the floor in just a second, but I think that there is another question that has come up in our chat, and I think we should now, with 16 minutes to go until the end, also take on a couple of questions from the audience. So I think there are two questions, one by Michael for Vivian, but also a second one that has come in through the chat, and that's basically about the increasing role, or the very heavy role of executives, especially in the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis. So all the solutions that have been found are very executive heavy. And the question is, how can this be redressed? Can there be a way to kind of bring in also maybe civil society, or maybe also parliaments somehow? Again, I think you spoke about parliaments, but what about civil society? I think I would like you to take that on board as well when answering maybe also Michael's comment. Vivian.
Okay, so you do want me to respond now. Okay, yeah, two things. First, in response to Michael, I understand your concern, but my idea of differentiated integration is not Europe a la carte with totally separate policy communities, because all the member states, a large majority of member states would be participating in a large majority of these, of the different policy communities. I mean, in fact, this is exactly what we have already. So it's simply a question of recognizing this. There'd still be one set of institutions, and you would still have a debate and deliberation within the institutions. So in terms of what I see is already going on in the EU is a tremendous amount of politicization and contestation, a kind of politicized dynamics of interaction amongst the various EU institutional actors as we now see it. You think about the Eurozone crisis, there's massive amounts of contestation. As Wolfgang Schäuble complained about the Commission, complained about the ECB, as the Commission said, no, we're a political actor, as the European Parliament complained, wrote critical reports, held hearings, etc. So I think in that way, we actually already see a significant amount of deliberation and contestation. I don't see that going away with simply recognizing that the EU going forward is going to have perhaps more opt-outs in one or another policy community, in one or another area. But how else is the EU going to move forward in kind of deeper integration? And it seems to me that rather imposing, for example, the migration crisis, rather than imposing, as the Commission proposed, to impose quotas on everyone, create new kinds of incentives through different funds. This is what I see for for a permanent resilience and recovery fund would be to provide money for different kinds of funds for just migration programs, for refugee adjustment and integration programs, and a whole range of things, so that member states see themselves in an interdependent policy community interdependence as well, and will choose to opt in rather than constantly opt out. But there's a lot more that one would need to discuss on this. And then on emergency powers and the role of executives, I've just done a piece for the debate section of the Journal of European Public Policy, where it was all about the role of the executives and emergency powers and legitimacy. And what's really interesting is if you think about emergency powers in the Eurozone, the Council went way beyond what it needed or should have done in terms of imposing restrictive, austerity and structural reforms and punitive programs on countries. And what's really interesting, of course, is all of that subsequently has been rolled back because of problems with, input and throughput legitimacy, if you will, because the output performance did not work. The ECB, in contrast, has taken more and more emergency powers, but rather than rolling them back, they've been ratcheted up. Why? Because they seemed legitimate in terms of output performance, as well as, we can talk input legitimacy because the bulk of citizens accept and approved, and procedurally as well. It was highly accountable, explained. It was reasonably transparent in explaining what it was doing. So with COVID-19, one could argue is that the Council was much more legitimate, even with these emergency powers, as I just mentioned with the ECB. I guess the question is, what about the member states? And there we see, as when the COVID-19 crisis hit, parliaments essentially gave away their own powers of oversight and said, okay, do what you have to. But what we're seeing now with the rollback of these emergency powers, sort of a recognition in most countries that, there's a limit. The one problem, of course, is what happened in some Central and Eastern European countries, in particular in Hungary and in Poland, where emergency powers were abused. So I think I should stop there.
Thank you very much. There are further questions coming in. One, I don't know to whom I should direct that, maybe to Bridget, is about the role of European political parties What role should European political parties play to increase the legitimacy of the EU and also maybe manage contestation? Could also take it to Michael, but whoever wants to respond to that.
So I don't think we should underestimate the role already of European level political parties. So how do they operate? Well, the party families clearly operate within the European Parliament. In the Commission, particularly under Juncker, it was very common for commissioners from the same political family to meet informally. That's politics. But there's nothing in their role that said that should be happening, but they were. And of course, as we know, the reason why the European Council, which is as close to a cabinet as the EU has, why it always meets in the evening, no cabinet across Europe would ever start meeting at 6 o'clock in the evening, is because the party groupings meet before they go to the European Council. So I think I do think that in certain circumstances, two ways in which party groupings at the European level would become more significant. One would be transnational lists. That would require organization beyond the national parties and beyond the party families as presently constituted. And if you had direct election of the Commission president, then that would also require a level of organization for the party groupings that doesn't exist at the moment. But we also know that parties as we once knew them, as these mass aggregating institutions, are much weaker now than they were historically in Europe. So what it is to be a political party and barriers to entry into politics are much lower now. We've seen over the last 20 years the ease with which challenger parties can move into party competition and party space. So I think parties already matter in Europe and I mean in the EU sense and not just in the national sense, but there would be ways where they could even become more important, but that would depend on institutional reform and institutional change. Can I say one thing just about DI, because we've a large DI project, and in fact there really is not much appetite at all for more DI across Europe. Opt-outs for individual member states, but they don't necessarily want other member states to be able to opt out. So in other words, they want the system to survive, but the choice for themselves. They don't want to be bound, but they want to bind others. But it is seen across political parties and governments as second best and only last resort. There isn't so I don't actually see any appetite at all for what I would call the rationalization of DI in the EU at the moment. But that's just the evidence that we've gathered so far. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question that relates basically a bit more to the conference on the future of Europe, and there the question is kind of the gap between Eurosceptic people maybe not participating as much in this conference, but maybe pro-EU elites kind of dominating, or pro-EU citizens and pro-EU elites driving this process. And I don't know, since Michael wasn't addressed in this final round, I think I'm going to put that to you. So what are your thoughts about I think it's an interesting question about the representation gap that there could be, and that we oftentimes kind of visit when we have forums of citizen participation. We always have these, cosmopolitan, highly educated people joining in, deliberating, maybe even finding solutions among themselves, and in the end, other people who don't have the time or the willingness or the resources don't participate in that. Is that going to be a problem of this process?
Yes, of this process, and to some extent, it's the problem of the EU as a whole, and that leads us probably back to this question of do we need to institutionalize opposition? Do we need to find ways that the vote is important? And do we need to internalize politicization? I mean, I'm one of the last ones who would argue that there is no politicization of the EU. It is, but the problem to some extent is that it comes from the outside. It is people challenge the EU as an institutional system. That's very much the mode of a lot of politicization that we see. And the task group essentially would be that this kind, and this challenging of the EU as a political system very much is driven by dissatisfaction with specific policies. And therefore, I think the major institutional task would be to internalize politicization, to give essentially those who are dissatisfied with the policies of the EU a voice within the EU, to avoid essentially, to use Albert Hirschman's trias of how you can react when you are dissatisfied with the outcome of something, that you have, besides loyalty and exit, also the third possibility, and that is voice. And as long as you don't have voice, there is a huge danger that this dissatisfaction translates into exit or something what I would label external politicization. And just to add this, to some extent, I also think that that this role of executives in those crises has something to do with that, because for many people who do not belong to the groups that you just mentioned and who do not belong to this political process, for them, of course, those crises are not only hours of the executive, they are also hours of the experts. And yes, of course, there were a lot of executive meetings overnight during the financial crisis, but in the end, as Damien pointed out, it was the ECB who was very decisive. We had many meetings among executives during the Corona crisis. We in Germany, in a federal system, saw this extremely clearly. I mean, there was no parliament. There was only the meeting of the chancellor with the minister presidents of the states. But then at the same time, it was, of course, also the mechanism via which the experts played an enormous role by being part of those meetings. So what I'm trying to say is this combination of executives plus experts leads again to a sort of a political mechanism to which many people feel that they don't have any access to. And that again leads, in my view, to the need to an institutional reform that allows those people to be part of the process.
Okay, thank you very much. I think time is quickly running out, so I think we should stop here, even though we could continue for a much longer time with this inspiring discussion. Of course, we didn't find any real conclusive solutions, but that was not to be expected. I think as my former supervisor, Wolfgang Wessels, always said after meetings with him, he would say, we are now exactly as confused as before, but at a higher level. So, and I think if that is what we have achieved, then I'm quite happy. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this exchange. It was really great. Thanks also for the audience. Of course, we couldn't take all the comments and questions. That is also clear. But as you all know, there is an online citizen platform of the conference on the future of Europe. So whatever you want to place there, just register and put it there, because in the end, basically, reforming the EU is a political process, and we as academic experts can just give some advice and see whether we have some things to read from empirical research that we have done, but we cannot make the hard political choices that need to be made in this in the practice, basically. Now, I should not forget to mention that the series of webinars on the Conference on the Future of Europe is not over. It's going to continue, and there is another webinar coming up on the 8th of June with Professor Christiane Landfried from the University of Hamburg, and the title of this webinar is Connecting Conference and Convention, a new perspective for a Europe of citizens. So please look at the RECONNECT website for further information, or just follow us on Twitter or any other kind of medium of your choice. So thank you very much. And I think by this, I am closing this meeting. Of course, also thank you to Bernd and Dana for working on this whole event. And yeah, thank you all and goodbye.